you from Dublin, but it's extremely nice to be able to gather with you virtually. And thank you to Stephen and his colleagues, and also to the director of PRONI, Michael Willits, for facilitating this. As Stephen says, I'm the director of this project Beyond 2022. And yesterday I had the pleasure of visiting the Court of Appeal in Dublin, which is in the Four Courts. And you'll be relieved to know that the court wasn't sitting. I wasn't there for any legal reason, but we had been granted access by the court service. And it was a very exciting moment for me, because the Court of Appeal is the reading room of the Public Record Office of Ireland that was destroyed in 1922. So for the first time in my life, having been working on this project for years, I was able to stand in the room where between 1867 and 1922, readers consulted the records of Irish history, those 7 centuries of material that Stephen has just referred to. And even more exciting for me, there was a moment when they opened a set of doors between the Court of Appeal and another building that's further behind, and I entered a enclosed space which in 1922 was a void. It was an empty space that acted as a fire break between the repository, which burned down entirely in 1922, and the reading room, which survived. So that was a very special moment for me to stand in that void, which acted as a fire break and protected the materials. This was literally 1 week after we had held another virtual meeting on the anniversary of the fire. Last week in Dublin, we held a research showcase for the project. And on that occasion, I took the opportunity to read an excerpt from the Deputy Keeper. So you still have a Deputy Keeper in PRONI. In 1922, there was a Deputy Keeper of the Public Records Office in Dublin. And he describes what it was like when he returned to that room that I stood in yesterday after the fire. He was allowed back in mid-July, so roughly when we're speaking to you now. And you have to imagine the entire back end of the building, the repository, has been destroyed. And for the first time, he's allowed to enter the public offices. And this is the quote. His name is Herbert Wood, by the way. You'll be hearing about him a few times across the course of these talks this afternoon. So Herbert Wood describes his visit, and it runs as follows. Although, he says, the fire did not extend to the Record House, so that's where the Court of Appeal was, where I was yesterday, which is at the end nearer the River Liffey in front of the repository, this latter presented a scene upon his return not easy now to be imagined. The search room, that's the room I was in, and other rooms were piled high with debris. Intermingled with furniture were volumes of will books and chancery order books, as well as the office files and correspondence. Out of the debris, the staff picked calendars and indexes, and fragments of calendars and indexes, and scattered pages of these calendars were found all over the building. The presence of explosive substances rendered the work of salvage dangerous, and the reality of the danger was proved by a miniature explosion which took place sometime afterwards in the strong room. Well, I was in the strong room as well yesterday. It's just off the main reading room, and there were no explosions. You would have no sense at all of what had happened there 99 years previously. But it gives you a sense of the total disarray that office found itself in after 1922. But the thing that I picked up on last week, and I'd say again today, is that was actually the good news story of 1922 for those members of staff. When they went into their old reading room and they saw the fragments of calendars and indexes everywhere, those are the indexes and calendars that now are the guides for us to where we can find materials to reconstruct what was lost in 1922. And they had that immediate impulse to start gathering materials together, to protect them, to rebind them, and to slowly start returning the chaos that confronted them to some kind of order. That's 99 years ago. Scholarship has developed enormously across the last 100 years. And in a way, Beyond 2022, as we come towards the centenary of the fire, is trying to bring together the work of the last century in terms of recovery, and also give it a new virtual, digital, computing-based existence for the centenary. So the project that I've been directing for the last several years began around 2015. I had the idea coming into the towards the end of the first phase of the decade of centenaries, that nobody at that point was talking about 2022, something that I had been working on for years as a medievalist. I'd been reconstructing medieval documents that had been lost in the fire. And so I was very aware of the significance of the fire and also how one might go about doing reconstruction from multiple archives. But there was no framework in which to do it yet. So that many years ago, conversations began, and we achieved funding from the Irish Research Council in 2016. And three important things came out of that first phase of the project. And the most important, I think, is bearing fruit in today's events. It's the collaboration that was built. Because in phase one of the project, we created a collaboration starting from Trinity, where I'm a historian, but immediately building, reaching out to our neighbours in Dublin, the National Archives of Ireland. National Archives of Ireland is the successor institution to the Public Record Office, destroyed in 1922, to the forerunning office, the Public Record Office of Chancery Lane, which is now the National Archives in Kew in London. So National Archives in Kew, if you date back its own ancestry, it would have been founded in 1838 as the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane. And then just under 30 years later, the Public Record Office Dublin opens up in 1867. Those two institutions are in that sense genetically linked. And they both became partners in the Beyond 2022 enterprise. And PRONI, of course, the one that retains its name, Public Record Office, Northern Ireland, founded after the fire, but absolutely connected in terms of its staff and its collections and its ambitions to recover from what was lost in the terrible fire. And we'll hear more about those connections in later talks. So that collaboration between those institutions, for the first time, those three public record offices working together with a common ambition in mind, that came out of phase one of the project. Second thing was that we returned to a document that had been neglected for 100 years. Neglected because it described something that had been lost. You may have heard of the Guide to the Public Record Office, published in 1919, just 3 years before the fire, published by the man I mentioned, Herbert Wood, and it's been described as the saddest book in Irish history because of the incredible detail that it provides for all these lost collections. Well, since 2016, Herbert Wood has become our touchstone. He's become our means of understanding what was in the building. And we created a computer database in which every series and item within the Wood's Guide of 1919 was given its own number. For those of you who are professional archives or working in that discipline, we followed international practice. Wood's Guide of 1919 was brought into ISA-G archival international standards for the 21st century. And that means that any item that can replace something from lost, that was lost in 1922 can, as it were, be hooked onto Wood's Guide of 1919 through the computer infrastructure that we've created. So that's the second point. And the third is, through that first phase, we really gained an understanding of the scale, scope, and significance of the replacement collections. So we knew what was lost through Wood's Guide, but we were really actually surprised in 2016 to 18 at how big in volume replacement collections were. Transcriptions made by antiquarians in the 19th century, duplicates, triplicates even, that were made in Dublin throughout the ages and sent across to Westminster, family papers in many collections. So the principle of the project is to try and bring as much of this together as possible in order to recreate the collection destroyed in 1922. So scale, scope, and significance. In terms of its scope, it extends right back to the earliest periods, to the 13th century, and covers the whole island of Ireland. So no region within the island is neglected in the materials that we're uncovering. So there's the collaboration, there's the computing database, and there's the realization of how much was out there to be discovered. And through funding from the Irish government, phase 2 was announced late last year in 2019. And as part of that, we were able to embed in our partner institutions in London and in Belfast researchers who would be dedicated to the task of not just knowing the material was out there in theory, but actually actively starting to bring it back in to build connections with archivists who could help us understand their own collections, and to expand the collaboration from the core partners out to a widening group of participating institutions. And really that's what today is all about. As Stephen says, it's an opportunity for us to tell a group of friends of PRONI about the project at an early stage, to have you hopefully become involved and interested and engaged in what we're trying to do. And if you are able to help, we would love to hear from you. I want to give you a sense also of where this will go across the next 2 years, because part of the exercise is to virtually reimagine what was destroyed, not just in the sense of bringing the collections back together, but also the building that disappeared. So I was lucky enough yesterday to be able to stand in the physical remaining part of the building that's been repurposed as a court within the Four Courts complex. But the area behind was completely lost. The repository, what was known as the Record Treasury, was destroyed. But through our digital humanities framework, we're able to reimagine what was lost, both in the sense of the collections and putting them back on virtual shelves. And that's a very exciting moment. And by September this year, when we have another event with PRONI on the 24th of that month, what we hope is that you'll be able to experience that with us. You'll be able to use through your computer browser or your tablet, you'll be able to enter the Record Treasury for the first time, go to the shelves and access records that are directly relevant to the history of Northern Ireland in particular. So that's where we hope to go by the end of the summer. But to give you a sense of that, what we have to share with you today is a short video that describes the events of 1922 and the journey that you'll be able to take in a couple of years' time, when you'll be able to enter the Record Treasury and explore and discover the materials in an entirely new fashion. So thank you very much for joining today. I hope you enjoyed the presentations from our researchers, and I hope you enjoy this glimpse of where we'll take this in the coming months and years. Handing over to Tim. Great.
Dublin, June 30th, 1922. Day 3 of the Battle of the Four Courts, the opening engagement of the Irish Civil War. Shortly after noon, the city is shaken by a huge explosion. After the blast, fire takes hold and plumes of white smoke are seen billowing from an arcade of tall windows in a corner of the Four Courts complex. This is the Record Treasury of Ireland's Public Record Office. Irish history, dating back over 700 years, is on fire. Inside the Record Treasury, the intense heat melts the high ironwork galleries and shelving, casting paper and parchment records into the flames below. Miraculously, one part of the building survives almost intact, except for a blast hole in the side wall. The Record House, and at its heart, the handsome search room, where researchers pored over historical documents, had escaped the worst of the damage. Now supported by the Government of Ireland, the Beyond 2022 project is reconstructing the search room in virtual reality. Here, readers in 1922 conducted their research beneath the natural light of a beautiful glazed ceiling. And for the first time in a century, we can reopen the double doors that led to the Record Treasury, passing through the fire break which stopped the blaze spreading to the front of the building. On the centenary of the fire, 4 steps will take you on your journey through Ireland's virtual Record Treasury. Explore, locate, connect, discover. Entering through the Record House, you can admire its elegant staircase before passing into the search room where your discoveries begin. From here, you can search the archive and travel to the very place in the lofty galleries of the Treasury where the records destroyed in 1922 have been reassembled from surviving copies and transcripts located in archives across Ireland and around the world. Now, next generation technology enables you to visualize the whole archive and make connections in ways that were unimaginable a century ago. Returning to the search room, you can discover more about the people, places, and topics contained in the documents. Beyond 2022, unlocking the story of Ireland and its peoples across 7 centuries, and reopening a lost archive to new generations with new questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. As Peter mentioned, there's a few archival institutions involved in this project. PRONI is one of them. And so I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Glenn Kelso, now to tell us about some of the types of records that can be incorporated into the project and why we feel Beyond 2022 is important. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Greetings from South Down. I would like to say a few words on the foundation of PRONI and on the opportunities we have as a core partner on the Beyond 2022 project. So I'm going to put some images up on the screen, so just bear with me a second. Okay, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland was born almost 100 years ago, established under the Public Records Act on the 22nd of June 1923. We are distinguished from other archival institutions in the United Kingdom and Ireland by our unique combination of private and official records. The Dublin Fire in 1922 set the scene for a close relationship between archival institutions on these islands. Yet it is to the Beyond 2022 project we look to for the first major collaboration in 100 years between the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, the UK National Archives, and the National Archives of Ireland. The destruction of the Public Record Office The destruction of the Public Record Office in Dublin led to a catastrophic loss. However, we have been fortunate that previous directors of PRONI were successful in identifying and collecting surrogate records and historical substitutes. And Tim will be introducing many of those later, the ones that he's working and searching for within PRONI. By combining archival discovery and technical innovation, the Beyond 2022 resource will highlight many PRONI records and will be a testimony to what has survived. I would like to chart a kind of preface to PRONI and Beyond 2022 using this scatter of documents you can see on the screen. As the official programme conveys, you can see there on the left, the new Northern Ireland Parliament was opened on the 22nd of June 1921, at which George V addressed, "For all who love Ireland, as I do with all my heart, this is a profoundly moving occasion in Irish history." The new Parliament was given powers to legislate over almost all aspects of life, including access to records, with civil servants allocated to the north moving to Belfast. In a letter to the Chief Secretary's office on the 23rd of March 1922, the Ministry of Finance stated their understanding that the provisional government does not object to the release of those men who have volunteered for service in the north. One gentleman with an interest to work in Belfast was David Arthur Chart. Chart worked for 16 years in Dublin, first in Dublin Castle with the State Paper Office, and then at the Four Courts as Inspector of Historical Manuscripts. Following the establishment of Northern Ireland in May 1921, he began seeking a transfer across the new border. So by March 1922, he was on loan from Dublin, with his transfer becoming permanent on the 21st of April 1922. The letter confirming his transfer was sent from Upper Merrion Street in Dublin, as the Record Treasury, along with the Four Courts, were occupied by anti-treaty forces. And in Belfast, Chart moved to a local office in Murray Street. As the first deputy keeper, D.A. Chart quickly became the driving force behind the new archive in Belfast. He focused on bringing in archives that would plug some of the gaps in the record created by the Dublin fire. From personal experience, he knew what had been lost. So leading PRONI until 1948, he expanded the archive by encouraging the donation of many important collections, the transfer of official records from Dublin, and the deposition of the established record for the 6 counties. By approaching solicitors, businesses, politicians, and the aristocracy, Chart and successive deputy keepers were able to compile a significant substitution for some of the destroyed manuscripts. The drive to secure and protect this archival heritage has resulted in holdings of over 3 million records covering every aspect of life in Northern Ireland. The first documents received by PRONI were 3 estate maps given by a Dublin firm of solicitors. The example on your screen is from 1736, and it maps a pre-modern landscape, including ring forts, houses, and land division, with a pencil sketch of a proposed town stretching across its face. Local people, their place and experiences are reflected in the established record collected by Chart and others. For example, the Register of St. Thomas's Church, Lisburn, on your screen on the left, includes some of the earliest surviving records of family events in Ireland. And the testimony of Catherine McTimpany in 1671, on your right, includes the names of individuals who at a time of penal law attended the Mass. Other institutions provided alternate copies. For example, 50 maps by cartographer Thomas Raven was copied by Ordnance Survey from originals held in Lambeth Palace, London. The original maps were commissioned in 1622 by Sir Thomas Phillips to form evidence submitted to Charles I. The example on the right of your screen illustrates the bawn of Baptist Jones Esquire, now Balachi, with several houses inhabited by English families, the name of the head of the household denoted under each property. Since PRONI's foundation, the plantation of Ulster has been a major theme in early collections. For example, a survey made under the direction of Josiah Bodley, depicted here on the left, provides a picture of the region 1 year before the plantation scheme was completed. So important was Chart's approach that it won backing not only from the minister responsible, but also from the Crown's representative in Northern Ireland, His Excellency the Governor, the Duke of Abercorn. The Abercorn papers were one of the first landed estate collections to come into PRONI's care, including this 1610 royal patent appointing lands in County Tyrone. And PRONI's medieval records are also of European significance. The earliest example on the left is the register of Milo Sweetman, Archbishop of Armagh in the late 14th century. Very much talking about the operation of the church from the primate's point of view, and indeed a lot of commentary on their interaction with Gaelic lordship. However, one of my favourite documents would have to be on the right of your screen, and it's vineyard accounts of 1411 from Chablis in France, which were rediscovered in family papers 400 years after the original 1536 General Edict determined a new destiny for one French Huguenot family. By 1662, the Irish Parliament passed a law to encourage the emigration of French Protestants to this island. The move from paper to digital is perhaps the biggest step change which divides us from our 1922 forbearers. This project is a brilliant opportunity to build our digital capacity, as digitized image collections, searchable content across our records, and a knowledge base for Irish history will enable seamless linking across collections, both within and beyond the virtual Record Treasury. And I hope you all, as a community interested in archives, will participate and help in this endeavour. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And Glenn's just done a very quick potted history of the early use of PRONI. PRONI is very much some of the deputy keepers that came after Chart. Heatley, Ken Darwin, the late, who's passed it away, Anthony Malcolmson, Dr. Joe Slater, they've all left their mark. Brian Traynor as well, and we're very much in their debt. We're now going to move on to what we hope to use the material for in the project. So Tim, I'm going to introduce two people. Dr. Tim Murder, who's the archival research fellow on the project, and Dr. Lynn Kilgallen, who's a historian who's working on what we're calling the knowledge graph. So I'm going to pass you over to Tim now.
Hello, hi, sorry, hopefully you can see me. Hello everyone. I would like to talk to you today just about my role in PRONI as someone engaging in archival discovery. It's sort of in my job title, with the Beyond 2020 program. And I'd like to explore some of the ways that we hope to reach out to researchers, to local historians, archivists, as well as to the wider public in our program of archival discovery. So what do I mean by archival discovery? Well, I've got a couple of slides that might be useful for this. Let me just open it up here. Begin here, slide. Yeah, there we go. So one of the things that Peter earlier on alluded to, that's part of archival discovery, is completing an inventory of loss and survival, figuring out exactly what we lost and what still survives from the destruction of 1922. Now, Peter referred to Wood's guide as one of the most saddest, or one of the saddest books in Irish history, and I would tend to agree. Coming up with an inventory of what was lost can sometimes be a very depressing or disheartening exercise. But it is a crucial task, and again, as has been alluded to, we actually have some very good sources for figuring out what exactly was in the forecourts in 1922. On the right hand of your screen, you have one of the very few images we have of the Record Treasury of the Public Record Office of Ireland, sort of in its heyday. And on the left hand side, you have one of the most important sources we have relating to that institution, which is one of the reports of the Deputy Keeper of the Public Record Office. 52 of these reports appeared between 1869 and 1921, and they provide a really, really in-depth description of what was going into this archive. For convenience sake, though, we also have the amazing work of Herbert Wood. His 1919 guide is incredibly handy because it's in a single volume, laying out the classification of the contents of this archive. And I would just sort of mention that both of these things, Herbert Wood's guide as well as all of those Deputy Keepers' reports, are currently on the Beyond 22 website. They're not only hosted on the website, they're also searchable, which is incredibly handy. So for anyone here who's listening and wants to learn more, they're a great thing to play around with to get a real flavor of what was actually inside this archive. Now, as Professor Crooks was describing, actually I probably should explain a little bit of what this image is before I sort of barrel on. This is one of the photographs we have, and there's a few of them, of sort of the immediate aftermath of the destruction of the Four Courts. And these are just sort of Dubliners out on the streets along Ormond Quay, picking up legal and perhaps historical documents that have been sort of scattered to the four winds. And it's it's obviously to a historian, it's a sort of shocking image. But I'll rest on it for just a second. As Peter has hinted, and as I think I'll hopefully be able to convey to you today, the richness of what was contained in this archive, it was astonishing. Now, the assumption amongst some people, both then and now, is that sort of what was lost in 22 was basically just the census, and maybe some boring administrative internal records. This was obviously not the case. The Record Treasury of the Public Record Office contained everything from guild records to railway inquisitions, from the records of landed estates courts to cholera reports in the 19th century. But probably the most important description of document that was destroyed, and it's really important to sort of get your head around this, simply the vast majority of paper produced by all the different organs of the state. Again, everything from the medieval exchequer, the court of chancery, to the workings of the Privy Council or the Lord Lieutenant, all the way down to the Barracks board. I have a little illustration there on the right of your screen of early modern barracks. And when you think about this sort of the sheer state of this, it's easy to sort of become overwhelmed by the sort of the task at hand. But it's important to remember that archival discovery is not just about contemplating loss, but about the sometimes quite surprising survivals, and exploring the capacity we have as historians with the tools we now have to actually replace destroyed collections. So, what records can we use to replace some of the material that was destroyed in 1922? Well, here's a list of some of the categories we think about in the project. The very first one, at the very top of the list, is what we call salved records. Very simply, these are original documents that were actually in the Four Courts and that were damaged by fire in 1922, but were not actually destroyed, and they're now in varying states of conservation. And the salved documents are very much part of the Beyond 2022 project, and staff in the National Archives of Ireland are working on them. However, those can only ever sort of replace a very small amount of the project. We have to look beyond that to finding some of the categories that are listed below that. Duplicates, particularly for official documents in the 19th century, there were actually sort of certified copies, which is another category on that list. Facsimiles, very early history of photography and sort of photozincography copying methods. Those do exist and we are searching them out. However, by far and away, one of the biggest categories of replacement document that we are seeking and we know is out there are what we've labeled here as transcriptions. These are copies made by researchers, historians, genealogists, antiquarians, and they are really, really, really important. We all are also looking for things like calendars, abstracts, indexes, some of which Peter alluded to there, the ones that actually survived in the front of the building in the Four Courts. All of these are vital tools. We are also looking at this final term that I put on the screen, and it's a term that is broad but very important. It's a term we've dubbed para-replacements. Now, what are para-replacements, you might ask? Well, they're material that was never inside the Four Courts, that's not derived directly from material that was in the Four Courts, but that can still act as a substitute or can give us information for some of the material that was in there or was destroyed. So, to provide you with an example, let's say there's a set of correspondence between Dublin Castle and the Home Office in London. All the letters that the Home Office sent to Dublin were sitting in the Four Courts and destroyed. Well, let's go look at the other half of the correspondence. What was Dublin sending to London? Can we infer things from that side of the correspondence that sort of make up for the loss? That's one very crude example, but that's the sort of stuff we are looking for. We are sort of flexible in what we're seeking to use as replacement material. Now, in seeking out all of these types of replacements, facsimiles, transcripts, calendars, para-replacements, PRONI is obviously a very rich source. As Glenn described, the first deputy keeper at DA Chart was a former employee of the Public Record Office of Ireland and was very aware of what had been lost. As such, PRONI has acquired an incredibly impressive collection which can compensate for some of this loss. I'm going to give you a couple of little examples of some of the real riches inside PRONI that can be used for the goals of Beyond 2022. So, for instance, one category I'm really interested in is the working papers and documents of 19th century historians, antiquarians, who were by far and away one of the biggest sort of producers of transcriptions of material in the 19th century. So hopefully on your screen you should be able to see or make out an image of George Benn, one of the most noted historians of Belfast, indeed arguably the first real historian of Belfast, as an first person to really produce an urban history of the town. There's other examples, I'm well aware. Maxwell Given, great chronicler of Coleraine, probably could also go up on here. But Ben in particular is a great example of someone who is tireless in transcribing sources. He acquired information from the Public Record Office on everything to do with Belfast, its population, a list of its religious ministers of all varieties, the internal workings of its municipal government, information on its prominent citizens. We are actively looking for material like the Ben papers, and if there is stuff out there that I'm unaware of, and I'm sure there's loads that I don't know about, in terms of sort of Ben figures in other parts of Ulster or beyond, we are definitely interested in hearing about that. I've mentioned local historians like Ben. I could also add to this genealogists and family historians, who were the other great sort of transcribers of the era. The names of some genealogists are well known to anyone who's tried to look up into sort of their family history in the modern day. So names like Francis and Philip Crossley, Tennyson Groves, William Beetham, Gertrude Thrift. These are well-known names to genealogists and family researchers. And material from many of these collections are spread over several repositories. Some of it is now actually available, thankfully, online. However, PRONI is particularly fortunate in having a large collection of material from the researcher Tennyson Groves. And I've put up an image from one of his notebooks contained in PRONI on your screen. Groves' papers contain just an absolute cornucopia of material. Abstracts from pre-1858 wills, muster rolls, militia lists, plea rolls, hearth money rolls, collector's accounts, exchequer rolls, notes from Griffith's evaluation, to name just a few of the types of documents that he was interested in. Now, Groves occasionally transcribed sets of documents, series, but more often than not, what you'll get is what's sort of shown in that image there. Information extracted from multiple sources, plea rolls, legal decisions, and it's not necessarily large, one-for-one transcriptions. It's information from these sources underneath one heading, usually a family that he's researching, although he occasionally did do things on a sort of a county basis. That can occasionally make the Groves material tricky to handle, but it is an incredibly rich source and one that we're dedicated to surveying. So we're interested in hearing about any other possible sort of holdings of Groves material. We're interested in hearing about similar type of material that might be out there from 19th century genealogists or anyone who sort of transcribed or worked heavily on pre-1922 sources and may have made copies. Now, another very important type of collection in PRONI, and it's one that Glyn hinted at, and I'm only going to have a little bit of time to talk about, but it's really, really important, is simply the large private family collections, particularly of the more prominent landed families who often held official positions in the church, state, or military. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it's really important to remember that the line between official papers and someone's private correspondence often got very blurry. Indeed, many prominent political figures had a habit of simply taking official correspondence with them after they finished in a role. This is something we're finding out when we're looking at the family papers of those who served as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Often a lot of the Lord Lieutenant official correspondence ended up in family archives, which is sort of actually great for what we're trying to do. So I'll give you just two examples, and they're sort of the more notable examples from PRONI of this sort of thing. On the left-hand side of your screen, you have an image of Robert Stewart, Lord Castlereagh, and his quite fulsome archive in PRONI includes much official as well as private correspondence. Castlereagh had multiple roles, very prominent roles. He started off early on in his career as Irish Chief Secretary, before going on to be Secretary for War in the colonies. He was Foreign Secretary. He He represented the government in the House of Commons at one point. However, it's actually his time as Irish Chief Secretary, which some historians actually have tended to sort of gloss over, which is one of the richest sources for destroyed, or what was presumed to have been destroyed material. Castlereagh was sort of very good at making copies of responses he gave. He collected and held on to internal memorandum and digests from the Chief Secretary's office. So for the period that he held that role, roughly 1797 to 1801, you've essentially got a very good substitute for Chief Secretary office material, which was one of the categories destroyed in 1922. On the right-hand side of your screen, you have a leading member of one of the other great family collections of PRONI, the Foster papers, also sometimes referred to as the Foster-Masserine papers. This is John Foster, first Baron Oriel, who served roughly, he was sort of contemporary to Castlereagh. He served as Chancellor of the Irish Exchequer. He was the last Speaker of the Irish House of Commons, most notably. And because of his very prominent roles, his papers yet again contain many copies of official correspondence, particularly those relating to trade and revenue, which he had a real interest in. These are just two examples, and they're sort of the big, well-known names, but there's numerous other families with many people from other lesser office holders who you'll find similar sort of things for. Official correspondence or copies of official correspondence sort of interspersed in with sort of estate papers and family and personal correspondence. So the real riches are hidden in those bigger collections. Now, I'm conscious of time, and I'm only leaving with you these few examples. There are many more we could talk about. Church of Ireland registers, estate rentals, the whole big question of testamentary papers. But I will leave you with these three examples. But I'm hoping that I've conveyed to you something of the type of material that we're seeking to discover. But one thing before I let you go, before I pass you over to my colleague Lynn, is that discovery is only part of the process in Beyond 2022. Discovery is the very first part of it, it's very important. But what do we do after we've actually identified this possible replacement material? Well, the second step we put up there is to digitize, to image it and to transcribe it, and to make searchable text and data. We then move on to the third step, reconstruction. We link these replacement materials back to their original Public Record Office of Ireland collections, reconstructing the lost archive. The end goal is to produce, or to provide access to a free-to-use public platform where you can search these materials. But more than just providing access, we also want to do more than that. And this is the fourth pillar of the project. We want to reveal. We hope to enhance the understanding of what's in these materials and their contents. And this is going to be achieved through a cutting-edge new technology, a knowledge base and graph, which my colleague Lynn will now talk to you about. So I will just pass over to Lynn.
Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, absolutely. So as Tim has just said, what I want to hopefully give you a taste of in my presentation is what we can actually do with these documents in Beyond 2022, how we can help anybody who's interested in these records held in PRONI and further afield in Beyond 2022's collections, and see how they can be navigated and how they fit into a larger historical context. So what I want to do is present a glimpse of the technologies that we're developing which can do this. So as Tim has said, the knowledge graph for Irish history, it's a new and innovative method of interrogating and searching historical records. What we're going to do with this, as you've heard Tim and Lynn discuss, this will help us to enhance our understanding of the links between various records themselves, but also, very importantly, the individuals, the places, and the events which are contained within them as well. So one thing that the knowledge graph will do is it will provide authoritative identifiers for entities. So these are people, places, events, or organizations which are mentioned in the collections processed by Beyond 2022. The Beyond 2022 knowledge graph is the product of close collaboration between the project's humanities team and its computer science team. So What I want to do today is introduce you to some of the work that's gone on behind the scenes in designing the knowledge graph. As a historian, I won't speak to the technical aspects behind the knowledge graph, but I should mention that for anybody who is interested in the amazing work that underpins the knowledge graph, we do have videos available on Beyond 2022's website, produced by Dr. Christophe de Bruyn of the ADAPT Centre, who is our knowledge graph expert and who's been developing these technologies. But first of all, what I want to do, and I'll try and share my screen with you now. Firstly, what I want to do is introduce you to the records that we have looked at as a test case, as our first example in developing these technologies. So hopefully this should bring up some material for you here. Our first large scale case study was actually drawn from the records of the medieval Exchequer of Ireland, which we've already heard mentioned once or twice in the previous presentations. The medieval Exchequer of Ireland was the financial cornerstone of the Irish administration of English government in Ireland in the Middle Ages. And on screen, I just have a couple of images here. Firstly, the largest image, you can see a facsimile reproduction of the medieval Irish Exchequer at work. And the original image that we're looking at here appeared in the Red Book of the Exchequer, which was lost in the Four Courts Blaze in 1922. But the reason that we're looking at this is because the activities of the medieval Exchequer and its officials, these records touched upon so many different aspects of life in medieval Ireland, political, social, day-to-day life. And so the Irish Exchequer records themselves are an incredibly rich historical resource. You can see an image of the original manuscript format of these records on screen. So these are receipts, records of payment, recorded on long rolls, and they're full of mentions of individuals who lived on the island at that time, but high status and lower status. And we also have lots of information about places, locations, and events. Now, because of the connections which existed between the English administration in Ireland and that in England during the Middle Ages, what we have is a wealth of largely untapped, in many respects, historical data, much of which is now located in the National Archives of the United Kingdom, in TNA, as well as in the National Archives of Ireland. The reason that we have this material is because Irish Exchequer officials were required to account for their financial activities at the Exchequer in England. So with copies of these records being brought physically across the Irish Sea in bags, like you can see on screen in the bottom right-hand corner. So because of this structure, because of this practice, it's possible to reconstruct a lot of the material that was lost in 1920-22. And I'm mentioning this particularly here because reconstructing these Exchequer records is going to be a central aspect of one of Beyond 2022's Gold Seam projects, the Exchequer Gold Seam. So reconstructing these entire series of medieval Exchequer records and making these available to researchers. But to get back to the technologies that we're developing, one central element of reconstructing these Exchequer records, drawing on records held within Ireland and further afield, will be to include approximately 1 million extractable data entities. So these are the names of people, places, and subjects that I mentioned, and including them within the Beyond 2022 knowledge base. So this is again providing us with a way of navigating these records. Now, going on to the next screen, as a test case for developing the knowledge base, we actually used historical data from a published calendar of medieval Exchequer payments. So this is from the index of Philomena Connolly's Irish Exchequer payments. It was published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission in 1998. So what you're seeing on screen now, in effect, is the same type of information that we've seen in those fantastic images of the rolls themselves, now contained in the format of a published book, a published calendar. And this is where most of the information in our test case was drawn from. One thing that I want to point out for everybody watching is that while the case study that I'm introducing to you today focuses on medieval exchequer records, the framework that is being developed as part of this test case, the technology, the concept behind it, is designed to be adaptable. It can be used to collect data not just from medieval records, but early modern sources too, exactly the kind of records that Tim is discovering in PRONI's archives and that Glyn has been discussing with you. So the point of this is, in effect, its adaptability. I'll give you a quick glimpse of one of the ways in which we brought across the information contained in the printed calendar to the knowledge base itself. We did this through spreadsheets. And basically, this involved a historian, myself, taking the information in the index and populating a spreadsheet, which would be used then by our computer scientist, Dr. Christophe de Bruyn, to transform into the knowledge graph. So a large amount of this work is based on close collaboration to do this. The schema that's been developed here is allowing us to enrich, to contextualize the data that we find in our historical records through various categories. So some of the ones you'll see here are surname variations, date ranges, occupations, social status, gender, and so on. And the idea is also that we can, through identifying relationships, begin to link these individuals to one another. So to discover patterns and relationships that might not otherwise be apparent to us looking through the manuscripts themselves. Just to give some context, the spreadsheet that you can see on screen contains historical data on over 2,000 individuals mentioned in the Irish Exchequer Payments calendar. So this has been filled in and populated with as much historical information and context as possible. This was done manually, but in the future, given Beyond 2022's aim to digitize and transcribe so much material, it will be possible to automatically extract this information from digitized records, and so allow us to link those collections together as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I really can't speak, unfortunately, to the technical work that Dr. Christophe de Bruyn has done behind the scenes to take this data contained in a spreadsheet and transform it using knowledge graph technologies into such an exciting new medium for researchers. But what I can show you is the product of his work behind the scenes. And I'm going to try and bring up here a quick demo video which hopefully will play, and give you a showcase of what the knowledge graph can do. So particularly unpicking patterns, identifying links between people and places and offices that wouldn't necessarily be apparent to us. So I'll press play here. What we're going to see is one method of searching through the data contained in the Irish Exchequer payments. And one way of doing this, given that the Exchequer was such an important cornerstone of governance, is by searching for the individuals whose offices, whose administrative offices were mentioned. So the first one that Christophe is searching for in this video is Treasurer of Ireland. And what we're doing is we can see now, based on all of the information that has gone on into the knowledge graph, a long list of people who've been identified as Treasurers of Ireland. And this is amazing, just seeing them all come up on screen together. There will be very familiar names. We have quite a few Archbishops of Armagh actually as well, and those are such important records in PRONI's archives. What we can do though is add another search term. So the next one we're looking at is Chancellor of Ireland. Similarly, again on screen, you're getting a long list of individuals who've been identified as Chancellors of Ireland in these Exchequer records. But what's really interesting, and what I want to draw your attention to here on screen, is the links that are starting to emerge between them. So what we can see, actually, in fact, is not only the names of all of these individuals who have data associated with them, but 4 people who the knowledge graph has identified as holding both offices at some point during their careers. And this in itself is very exciting as a historian to see. We can take this further. We can explore another office, the Justiciar of Ireland, and this was really at the top levels of governance in the medieval period. Similarly, again, we're seeing a long list of individuals who the knowledge graph has identified as holding this office. And again, we can see, just by looking at this, that some of the people who held the chancellorship and the treasurership also were justiciars of Ireland. We can find one individual, Alexander Balscott, who in fact held all three offices. And this is the kind of work that as a historian, it can take a really long time to get through and to do manually. And this is just one of the ways that the knowledge graph can actually make that work so much more exciting in uncovering new patterns for us. I'm conscious of time, and this is all very, very exciting material for us. In terms of the future potential of the knowledge graph and what we can do with it, we can also incorporate place and start linking individuals who are mentioned across various records with the places that they are associated with. And this is obviously particularly interesting for anyone who's interested in local history, as well as researchers more broadly. So with that in mind, I think one of the key takeaways for historians using the knowledge graph in Beyond 2022 is that this isn't just a tool or a project for collecting and organizing historical data. This is allowing historians to conceptualize the historical data in a new way, revealing unseen relationships and connections between people, places and organizations, and as we saw in the video, offices, connections which wouldn't necessarily be apparent otherwise. And obviously this has a vast potential. The more information that goes into the knowledge graph, the more information that we collect from all of these records, from the kind of material that Tim is hoping to uncover in PRONI's collections, the greater the power of the knowledge graph becomes. So I'll hand back over to Tim now. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lynn. That's absolutely astonishing. Every time I see more and more of the knowledge graph, the more impressed I am about sort of the power of that technology. I would like to just show you one thing, and it's basically just really to speak to what Lynn was just saying, which is about the nature of the nature and the potential of that knowledge graph. The great thing about Beyond 2022 is not just reconstructing the archive, discovering things that could substitute for what was lost, but actually fundamentally shifting how we structure knowledge, how we think about things, how we make links. It is potentially the big game changer, not only for academic historians, those writing sort of the big histories, but for those who want to go down to the granular level, those who are doing local history, those who are doing family histories, researchers working as genealogists. All of these things can benefit from what Beyond 2022 can offer you, but we need your help. If you have useful tips or suggestions, if you know of potential replacement material, whether it's stuff you discovered in PRONI that you think I may not sort of have on my radar, or if it's material in repositories which we are not talking about, if there's actually a repository you think I should look at, we are interested in talking to you. I've set up an email, hintsfortim2020@gmail.com. It's pretty simple. I mean, you'd be able to find me online anyway, but this is the email that I sort of most avidly sort of look at. So if you have suggestions, please don't feel shy about contacting me. We are eager to collaborate. The scale of what Beyond 2022 is trying to achieve cannot be achieved by any one single person. It has to be a collaborative effort. And that means reaching out to researchers across the island in all sorts of different walks of life and types of research. Now, for those of you, if there's anyone listening today who works in a repository or works as a heritage officer or in the sort of heritage sector, we are trying to come up with ways in which to engage with people to help not necessarily filter, but perhaps structure group participation and mass participation in the project. We're currently in the sort of midst of coming up with a questionnaire, a checklist for potential sources that people are going to sort of contribute to. You don't need to worry about this now. Don't worry. You don't need to fill out a form to send me an email. Just send me an email. It's fine. I'm happy to engage with you. But this is the type of thing we can see ourselves doing much more in the future, and it's something we are incredibly open to. We would like to dispel any sort of notion that we're sort of away in our ivory tower, and that's the end of it. So, as Lynn and several other speakers today, like Lynn, like Peter, have suggested, this really has the potential to really change the way research into Irish history is done. But we do need your help. So I'll stop my plea there and leave it. Just stop sharing the screen.